Final Fantasy games have achieved renown for a number of reasons, pioneering as they have the conventions of Japanese RPG gaming, and in doing so, building out tropes and expected patterns for how these particular experiences pan out. Chief among these is the sequentially evolving and increasingly absurd end boss, an expectation that has entered the realms of meme and become a staple for the concluding moments of these epic sagas. Yet among what is already an often egregious liberty being taken with logic, Final Fantasy IX stands distinct for many fans owing to its seemingly nonsensical curveball end boss of Necron. So why, among all this liberty taking, does Necron stand distinct in its absurdity? In large part, this is probably down to the fact that, although end bosses in Final Fantasy games lean towards the ridiculous, they do start off and emerge out of a relatively expected and consistent arc with the main adversary of the story. For example, Sephiroth evolves into the seraphic uber-deity Safer Sephiroth in Final Fantasy VII, but that is still some semblance of the Sephiroth who we know and have pursued throughout the game. And even Ultimecia, who was a relatively criticised, sparsely seen villain through Final Fantasy VIII, had consistency with story in how we fought her, we then fought Griever, and then we fought this time-consuming, crazy version of Ultimecia as the very final boss. It's the same character that we have learnt about throughout the story of Final Fantasy VIII, and so had some semblance of logic there. Now, turning to Final Fantasy IX, we battle through Trance Kuja at the endgame, as many might have expected by this point, because he proves the constant foil through the game events, particularly following the demise of Queen Brane, kind of early midway into the game, and it seems that we've reached a logical conclusion here by fighting Kuja. However, once he's defeated, we have an ominous voice appear, and Necron descend from the sky, an unexpected Deus Ex Nusquam, who nobody in the game story had mentioned or even alluded to up until this point in the final moments of the game. As such, Necron has entered the vernacular of Final Fantasy fandom as something representing the anthology's occasional pivots into absurdity and the nonsensical, but taking a step back and really looking at Final Fantasy IX, assessing the game from a thematic perspective rather than necessarily a narrative one, is there a case to suggest that Necron is not only a plausible end boss, but actually perhaps the perfect one to encapsulate the essence of what Final Fantasy IX is all about? Now, I've touched on Final Fantasy IX's unique structure in the past, particularly in how it is a thoroughly ensemble character piece of a game, with as much, if not more so, attention given to the individual journeys and character arcs of Zidane, Garnet, Vivi, Steiner, and so on, as it does to an overarching story and a three-act structure that arrives at a macro conclusion. And Final Fantasy IX is also a game that leans heavily with these characters into existential themes and existential dilemmas, and one need only consider the unique character quote panels that preface the game's startup screen, where we have Steiner's panel questioning whether he must spend his life in servitude, Vivi's panel questioning whether we even exist, maybe we don't exist, and Garnet's asserting that she may be queen, but she will always be herself. Each of these captions is unique to these particular characters, and yet they all encapsulate the main thrust of Final Fantasy IX's themes, which is very much to do with life. It represents these characters' perspective on life and how they are living it. So as I say, Final Fantasy IX is very much to do with existential perspectives, and it can be read in a very existential way when we look at these individual character journeys and the sort of dialogue they have and the scenarios that they go through. And without retreading the entire corpus of existential thought, we know that celebrated writers such as Jean-Paul Sartre encouraged finding meaning in an inherently meaningless world. And for example, we had Nietzsche, we had the whole God is dead element of existentialism, which I think Final Fantasy IX in its own way sort of rides on. And one of the most poignant terms to come out of this was the idea that existence precedes essence, as it were. And this is the burden that is borne out by each of our major characters, including, actually, I think, Kuja, the main antagonist, who is revealed to be a much more sympathetic villain by the end of the game, and whose journey into destruction was rooted simply in his being unable to cope with his own mortality. So Final Fantasy IX deals with the themes of life in every key character, and beyond that, how to live life well, I think, which is the end goal and the resolution for these character dilemmas. How not to live in regret, how not to feel shackled to the past or a pre-designated path, but rather embrace living life in all of its finiteness. And so, in dealing with the theme of life through the game story, what better end boss to have than the harbinger of death itself, this weird esoteric Necron, whose name is literally the etonym of death, and whose stated aim is to return all life to the zero world, the void, as he puts it. So, yes, it certainly is a creature that emerges as a curveball in the end game, but it's also, I think, upon reflection and looking more broadly at Final Fantasy IX, one of the most unique enemies in how it achieves two things. Firstly, it permits Kuja to have a redemptive arc, which I always really liked in this game. It's very uncommon for a Final Fantasy villain to see their redemption, see the error of their ways, and yet this is very much what happens to Kuja. And in a very poignant way, kind of thinking about the themes that we've just discussed, he turns from someone who was fighting so vindictively against his own mortality to someone who literally sacrifices himself to save Zidane and the party once he sees how they embrace life. And that was a particularly epic moment because, again, it was him showing in these final moments that life is worth living well in all of its finiteness, I suppose. So in his closing moment, he gave himself over to Zidane's way of thinking. Secondly, as mentioned, creating an end boss who addresses themes rather than plot or story really makes for a unique conclusion to Final Fantasy IX. It adds weight to that closing FMV, where we see the characters embracing their best lives, unshackled from the past and these fraught, dramatic captions that we saw in the beginning of the game. And to quote Sartre again, freedom is what we do with what is done to us. That is something that Kuja didn't learn until his dying moments. And yet here we see the party has collectively achieved and conquered. You know, they have overcome the void in the form of Necron by embracing all that is finite and finding their true meaning. And I think this is most expressly and bittersweetly captured by the character of Vivi in the ending, or rather Vivi's absence in the ending. And I would like to go back over and discuss the Final Fantasy IX characters at a later date. But there we have it, a top-level defense and discussion of the mysterious Necron end boss, who has become one of the most controversial end bosses in Final Fantasy history. And I think speaking to the abstract and the thematic, rather than necessarily like the literal story, I think it was a very interesting approach for an end villain that Hironobu Sakaguchi proposed here. And in all, Necron perhaps doesn't quite earn that reputation for being a JRPG meme villain that he seems to have ascended to